She looked like any other teenager in her neighborhood. Quiet, ordinary, someone who could easily blend into a crowd. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, there was a restless mind, a hunger for excitement, and a disregard for rules. Early on, she discovered that stealing gave her a rush unlike anything else. A wallet here, a neighbor's trinket there. The small victories tasted sweet, and nobody could stop her. By the time she was a teenager, her petty crimes had escalated. She started selling drugs, small quantities at first, just enough to make extra money. But the thrill of bending the law, of living in the gray areas where consequences felt distant, became addictive. Her friends admired her confidence. Her family whispered warnings that she ignored. She wasn't a reckless girl. She was calculating, clever, and growing more dangerous with every act that went unpunished. The law, naturally, was always lurking, but she had a way of slipping through the cracks. For a while, it worked. She avoided arrests, evaded suspicion, and even managed to charm her way out of close calls. Every success reinforced her belief that she was smarter than everyone else, that the world was hers to manipulate. But the bigger the crimes became, the sooner the inevitable confrontation would come. And it did. One night, her small drug operation caught the attention of the authorities. She didn't see it coming until the flashing lights illuminated the street and the sound of sirens screamed in her ears. Officers stormed in, shouting orders she couldn't understand over her pounding heartbeat. Hands were cuffed behind her back, and she was dragged out of her home, the cold metal biting into her wrists, the weight of reality finally settling in. She had crossed a line she could no longer hide from. Jail was different from anything she had ever experienced. The gray walls, the steel doors, and the constant surveillance were meant to break people, to strip them down to nothing. But she didn't crumble. She observed. She listened. Every whispered conversation, every newspaper clipping, every story about crimes and criminals became pieces of a puzzle in her mind. She wasn't just surviving. She was studying the world from behind bars, waiting for the moment when her knowledge would become power. It was during those long, solitary nights that she began to plan. She started writing, carefully, meticulously. She wrote notes, lists, diagrams. What began as observations evolved into a blueprint, a comprehensive plan that would guide her actions once she left prison. 40 different methods, detailed instructions for stealing, manipulating, and even killing, all written in a notebook that no one suspected could hold so much danger. Her cellmates noticed her writing, but nobody could have imagined the scope of her plan. They saw scribbles, they saw a notebook, they saw a girl who seemed withdrawn. But she was far from ordinary. Every detail was intentional, every word had purpose, and as the pages filled, a dark vision of her future took shape. A vision that involved more than just theft. It involved control, fear, and lethal precision. She spent her prison time mastering patience, honing her schemes, and waiting. The authorities thought they had confined a small-time criminal. They didn't realize she was crafting the tools of something far more dangerous. The world outside would not recognize her when she returned, not because she had changed in appearance, but because she had evolved into a thinker, a planner, a predator. And then, after years of incarceration, the day came when she walked out of those prison gates. She was free, but freedom wasn't liberation, it was opportunity. Her notebook, carefully hidden, came with her. Every method, every strategy, every carefully plotted scenario was now ready to be executed. The world had no idea the nightmare that had been quietly prepared behind prison walls. Her first steps back into society were deceptively calm. She smiled, blended in, and acted like someone who had served her time and moved on. But inside, the pages of that notebook were alive, pulsing with anticipation, and soon enough they would demand action. What happened next would shock a quiet neighborhood, terrorize the elderly, and reveal the terrifying mind of a woman who had been plotting in plain sight. The first victim was about to be chosen, and the story that started with petty theft was about to descend into something far darker, a spiral of calculated, cold-blooded crime that would leave a trail of fear in its wake. Prison was supposed to break her. The gray walls, the locked doors, and the constant scrutiny were meant to crush hope, to turn people into shadows of themselves. But for her, it became a school, a lab, a place where her mind grew sharper with every day. She observed everything: the guards, the routines, the vulnerabilities of other inmates. She listened to stories of crimes gone wrong, watched the patterns of people who failed, and stored every detail away, filing it meticulously in her mind. And then she wrote. At first, it was just notes, reminders, musings, sketches, but soon the notebook transformed into a full-fledged manual, a dark blueprint of what she intended to do once she left prison. 40 methods, 40 ways to rob, manipulate, and even kill, each one carefully thought through. Timing, opportunity, escape. She considered variables, risks, and even contingencies when things went wrong. It wasn't chaos, it was precision. Her cellmates noticed her obsession with the notebook. They called her strange, paranoid, and even dangerous, but they didn't know the half of it. They didn't see the cold calculation behind her calm exterior. While they gossiped or argued over petty squabbles, she was building a world that didn't yet exist, a world where she had total control, where fear became her weapon and nobody could touch her. The guards, too, saw nothing. She followed the rules, kept her head down, smiled when required, and acted submissive. It was a perfect disguise. But every night, in the dim light of her cell, she turned her thoughts inward. She imagined scenarios. Who would be vulnerable? Who would resist? How to manipulate fear? She wrote down plans for burglary, deception, and even murder. Each page of the notebook was a step towards her ultimate freedom, a freedom that wasn't just about leaving the prison walls, but about leaving her mark on the world outside. She studied people, too, the elderly, the weak, the people who could be controlled. She analyzed them as if they were chess pieces, thinking several moves ahead. The more she wrote, the more confident she became that she could execute her plans perfectly once the opportunity arose. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail was calculated: escape routes, backup plans, how to cover her tracks. Even the thought of murder, which had once been abstract, began to feel like a skill she could master. She didn't fantasize about violence. She approached it with the cold logic of a tactician. Her notebook wasn't a diary, it was a manual, a strategy guide, a set of instructions that she intended to follow to the letter. Months turned into years. She became adept at hiding her obsession in plain sight. She laughed at jokes, shared meals, followed routines, and yet the notebook was always there, her silent partner in crime. Guards never questioned her diligence. Inmates never suspected the danger she carried behind closed doors. And then the day came. She was granted early release. The prison gates opened, and the world she had been studying from behind bars suddenly lay at her feet. But she didn't walk out as the same girl who had entered. She walked out as a planner, a strategist, a predator in human form. The notebook came with her, hidden, protected, the map of what was to come. Her first steps back into freedom were careful, calculated. She moved through the streets, observing, testing boundaries, seeing who was vulnerable, who could be her first target. She smiled at neighbors, nodded to the mail carrier, appeared harmless, all while the notebook burned in her mind like a blueprint for the crimes she had already mastered. She waited. Patience was key. The first victim would be someone she could approach with ease, someone who would never see it coming. And when she struck, it wouldn't be sloppy or reckless. It would be deliberate, precise, and horrifying in its efficiency. Every page she had written, every hour she had spent in planning was about to be tested in the real world. Her first move would mark the beginning of a series of events that nobody could have predicted. The calm, ordinary streets of her neighborhood were about to be shattered by fear. The world believed she was just another ex-inmate trying to start over. They were wrong. The notebook had prepared her for this, and she was ready to follow it to the letter. What happened next would shock an entire community, reveal the depths of her cunning, and set a terrifying precedent for what was to come. The first victim had already been chosen. All that remained was to execute the plan. The streets were quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that makes even the bravest feel exposed. She moved with purpose, a calmness that belied the storm brewing in her mind. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated. The notebook had prepared her for this moment, the first real test of everything she had spent years planning behind prison walls. Her first module would be simple, chosen with precision. An elderly neighbor, 83, living alone, trusting, unassuming, someone who could be approached without raising suspicion. She watched her for days from a distance, noting routines, the timing of visits from friends and delivery people, even the sound of the lock on her door. It wasn't just observation, it was intelligence gathering. Every detail was fuel for the plan. The day finally came. She knocked politely, smiled when the door opened, and greeted the old woman as if nothing was amiss. She carried herself with an air of normalcy, the mask of harmlessness perfected during her years in prison. The woman welcomed her in, unsuspecting, the kind of innocent trust that would soon become a fatal weakness. Inside, she moved carefully, just as she had rehearsed in her mind. Small talk, laughter, the appearance of friendliness, all to lower the guard of her victim. Then, subtly, she steered the conversation toward topics that revealed the woman's vulnerabilities. She learned about her savings, her routines, her habits. Every word was a piece of the puzzle, every gesture a window into what could be exploited. And then it happened. The theft was clean, efficient, almost clinical. A wallet taken, jewelry moved into her bag, nothing left behind that could immediately identify her. She smiled, thanked the old woman for her time, and left with the same casual grace she had entered. To anyone watching, it was just a friendly visit, but to her, it was the first proof that her plans could work. The notebook's strategies were effective. Precision had succeeded where recklessness could have failed. But the notebook demanded more than theft. It was never just about stealing. It was about control, about dominance, about demonstrating the power she had cultivated in prison. And so, the moment she was outside the door, a cold decision had to be made. She executed it without hesitation, a terrifying efficiency honed by months of preparation and years of instinct. The first victim's life was extinguished, leaving behind a silence that screamed louder than any alarm. She walked away, blending seamlessly into the neighborhood. No one suspected. Nothing seemed out of place. But inside her mind, a storm of exhilaration and calculation raged. She had tested her blueprint, and it had worked perfectly. Her confidence soared. Her obsession deepened. The notebook's promise had been fulfilled. At least once. For the world outside, the news of the old woman's death would come as a shock. For her, it was validation, a confirmation that the methods she had honed in prison were lethal in the real world. But even with success, a part of her mind remained cautious. The notebook had contingencies. Every step had a backup plan. Every risk had a countermeasure. She knew that mistakes could be fatal, not for her, but for her freedom. Yet even with all her preparation, she underestimated one thing: human error. She had accounted for most variables, but not all, and it was in that gap, that tiny sliver of unpredictability, that the seeds of her downfall were already beginning to take root. Within a week, she would attempt her second operation, confident, meticulous, and driven by the same compulsive desire to test her methods. She moved forward without hesitation. But this time, the plan that had succeeded before would not be noticed. Someone was watching, someone was paying attention, and the notebook that had promised control and dominance would soon reveal its limits. Her first act was a success, her second would expose her, and the spiral that had begun with petty theft, carefully planned in the gray walls of prison, was now accelerating towards consequences that could not be ignored. The neighborhood remained calm, the streets deceptively safe, the people unsuspecting, but the air was charged with tension, as if the darkness she had carried from prison had seeped into the cracks of normal life. The first victim's story would be told, whispered among neighbors, yet the real horror had only just begun. The notebook was still with her, ready, waiting. 40 methods, 39 left, and each one, she believed, would be executed with the same precision as the first, until fate, oversight, or circumstance intervened. The first crime was executed flawlessly. The streets were calm, and the neighborhood had no idea that a predator had already walked among them. She had proven to herself that her plans worked. Confidence surged through her veins, and the notebook, her dark companion, whispered that the next operation would be even smoother. She waited just long enough to avoid suspicion. Patience was part of her method. Haste was a mistake she had learned to avoid in prison. She studied her next target carefully, just as meticulously as she had with her first. Another elderly neighbor living alone, trusting, vulnerable. She memorized every routine, every schedule, every moment when the doors were unlocked and the streets empty. Every detail was recorded in her mind, every contingency already accounted for. The morning of the second attempt, she left her home with a casual stride. No one suspected the danger she carried with her. She smiled at passersby, nodded at a neighbor, and made it appear as though she was merely running errands. Every movement was calculated, every gesture rehearsed. She had done this before, and the familiarity gave her a dangerous comfort. But life, she was about to discover, is rarely predictable. She knocked on the door and was greeted warmly as she had planned. Small talk, questions about the day, a laugh here, a polite comment there, all designed to lull the victim into trust. She inched closer, subtly observing the environment, noting escape routes, entry points, anything that could be useful. Everything seemed perfect. And then, the unthinkable happened. A friend of the elderly woman had come by unexpectedly. The timing was off by mere minutes, but it was enough. Her presence created confusion, disrupted the routine, and left her momentarily exposed. She realized instantly that the plan had shifted, that her calculations had a flaw. Panic, which she had long trained to suppress, surged for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. A neighbor passing by the window noticed something odd. A figure moving suspiciously, a hand reaching where it shouldn't. Phones were dialed, glances exchanged, and suddenly the calm she had maintained was gone. The plan that had succeeded once now began to unravel. The authorities arrived quickly. Within hours, the quiet streets were flooded with flashing lights, and the tension that had been building in her mind erupted into chaos. Her notebook, her carefully crafted blueprint, was found. The 40 strategies she had written, the meticulous notes, the chilling instructions, all exposed. She had underestimated the smallest of variables, human unpredictability. Her arrest was dramatic but efficient. No struggle, no escape, just the stark realization that her carefully planned freedom had been cut short. She was led away in handcuffs, the streets now filled with questions, whispers, and fear. The first victim's death had already been reported, and the second attempt, though unsuccessful, revealed the terrifying scope of her planning. Once in custody, investigators pored over her notebook. They couldn't believe the level of detail, the cold logic, the precision of her plans. 40 methods, all designed for maximum effectiveness and control, all prepared in secret behind prison walls. Her previous life of petty theft and drugs now seemed like a prelude to something far more sinister. The neighborhood, once quiet and trusting, was now shaken to its core. People who had never feared crime before were forced to reconsider every interaction, every visitor, every knock on the door. The realization hit hard. The predator had been among them all along, blending in seamlessly, hiding in plain sight. And she was once again confined, this time facing the consequences she had long calculated for others, but never for herself. Sentencing was swift. 20 years to life, the courts declared. Her notebook would serve as evidence of intent, a chilling record of her premeditation and her capacity for calculated violence. Yet even in confinement, her story would not end. The meticulous planning, the patience, the obsession, all of it became the subject of fascination, of horror, of endless speculation. How could a young girl, once a petty thief, evolve into such a cold, calculated force? The answer lay in years of observation, of patience, of the kind of planning that most people could not even imagine. The world had witnessed her rise and her fall, but the shadows she cast would linger. The notebook, the methods, the victims, all reminders that human cunning, when combined with obsession, could create something terrifying. And for those who had watched, read, or heard her story, the question remained, could this happen again? Or had justice, finally, caught up with a mind too dangerous to be free? The arrest was swift, precise, and inevitable. After the first victim and the failed second attempt, the authorities had everything they needed. The quiet streets that had once offered her camouflage now watched as flashing lights surrounded her. The predator who had walked unnoticed among them was finally exposed. In custody, the weight of reality hit her. The notebook, the 40 meticulously crafted plans, the hours of calculation, and the patience of years in prison, none of it could save her now. The first victim's death had been flawless. The second attempt had failed because of a single, unpredictable human element. That small misstep had been enough to unravel the web she had so carefully spun. Investigators were stunned. 40 methods, each detailed with chilling precision, documenting not just theft but manipulation, control, and murder. It was a manual of intent, a blueprint of obsession, a testament to a mind that had evolved far beyond petty crime. Each page told a story of planning so cold, so calculated, that it sent shivers down the spines of even seasoned detectives. The trial was a spectacle. Neighbors, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts filled the courtroom, captivated by the unfolding story. The prosecution laid out the case meticulously: the first victim, the thefts, the attempted second crime, and finally the notebook, the artifact of premeditation. The evidence was overwhelming, the logic undeniable. Her defense tried to explain her upbringing, the bad influences, the early exposure to crime, but the notebook spoke louder than any testimony. The jury saw a mind that had studied, planned, and executed with frightening precision. The girl who had once been quiet, ordinary, and unnoticed had become someone who could strike fear with a single decision. When the verdict was announced, the room fell silent. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 20 years to life. Justice, deliberate and absolute, had finally caught up to the carefully orchestrated chaos she had created. For her, the notebook's power had ended. The plans, once alive in her mind, were now inert under lock and scrutiny. Her freedom, the stage on which she had rehearsed so many dark possibilities, had vanished. The predator was confined, the threat neutralized, and the streets she had once haunted were slowly regaining their peace. But the story left a shadow. The neighborhood would never forget. Residents spoke in hushed tones, locking doors and checking on neighbors. The tale of a woman who had blended in seamlessly, smiled politely, and carried a deadly plan hidden in a notebook became a cautionary whisper, a lesson about trust, vigilance, and the darkness that can exist behind ordinary faces. Even in confinement, the fascination with her mind did not fade. Psychologists analyzed the case, dissecting her obsession, her precision, her patience. True crime communities debated the implications. How could a single notebook, written behind gray prison walls, orchestrate terror in a community? The truth was chilling and simple. Obsession, cunning, and patience, when unchecked, can become lethal. The notebook had been both her weapon and her undoing. It had guided her actions, given her control, and ultimately exposed her. She had tested its methods in the real world, and the consequences were absolute. The first victim's death, the near miss of the second, the community shaken, and the final capture, all were reminders that meticulous planning does not guarantee freedom, and even the most calculated minds are subject to unpredictability. The notebook remained, now evidence, a dark artifact of human obsession, a warning for anyone who believed they could outthink the law, human error, or fate itself. So, her story ended where it had always been heading, behind bars, stripped of freedom, facing the weight of choices she had made and the lives she had touched with fear and death.
The streets were quiet again, the shadows receding, and the notebook lay silent. But the chilling tale would be told for years to come. A story of a mind too clever, too patient, and too dangerous to be left unchecked. The predator was gone, but the legacy of her obsession, her planning, and her notebook would linger forever. A stark reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, and that sometimes meticulous planning meets the one thing it cannot control.